had to become more and more bold and challenge myself. And I think, to be honest, too, that it became more personal for me as well when my brother and my sister-in-law got married. My sister-in-law is a Black woman, and now they're expecting a child too, who's going to be a boy. And when you're thinking about police brutality in this country, and now thinking about that my nephew, is going to experience that, and they're going to have to talk about things, and my brother having to confront, like, his wife having to share with him, like, some of the things that you and your dad did, like sneaking into a different spot at a baseball stadium. That's going to be different for our son than it was for you and your dad as two white guys. So I think that, as in so much of this kind of talk, I can study it as a pastor or as an academic or as a journalist, but it really becomes powerful when it becomes personal.
Right. Yeah.
I think
Yourself. Yeah. Yeah, and I really do that point of the Christian nationalism. Really, it's just another seed of white supremacy, and I'm glad that you were able to connect those dots, and really see a lot of that rhetoric is founded in white supremacy, and those things that are used to keep. And Christianity has been one of those tools that has been used in this country to solidify white people's place and standing in the world, as the next Jesus, really, in some ways, and just even anointing this country as the city on the hill, as God's great experiment, as God's bomb for the rest of the world. It's just, which is really, you could say, this is how white people see themselves, as we're the bomb, the healing, the God's perfect specimen, what God really meant when he created creation. And I think that that's really hard for a lot of Christians to grapple with, not only white Christians, but a lot of us. It's the water that we've been swimming in for so long, and to really begin to start to unpack that and ask the more difficult questions, and probe people, that becomes a deeper challenge. Just thinking about, back to your book, even when you were talking evangelicals of color, and I'm just thinking of I think I mentioned, I wanted to bring this up to you, it's a Hispanic leader that's evangelical, and he's still stumping hard for Trump. You mentioned the whole pro-life thing, and they, in interviews, that's been mentioned to him, and so then they bring it to COVID. Well, what about his COVID response? And and I know I'm thinking, like, all these people must be getting trained the same kind of training, because they come up with these same kinds of answer that is just not taking responsibility, passing through what the real issue is. And I'm looking at him and I'm watching him, and I'm just like, wow. He said, well, I did vote for Obama, but he switched and he's still hardcore Trump. And I'm just like, and people ask him about immigration stance, ask him about the families and kids in cages. And so I was just wondering, like, was it anything that you noticed when you were writing the book, as you were, if you even had a spidey sense, maybe these lights weren't on for you. So I don't know, this may not be a fair question, so we can just talk about it in current stance time too, if you want to. But I was just wondering if you saw anything that really stood out to you as extremely unusual and or cult-like.
Well, one example that I'm thinking of when we're talking about this is the chapter that I wrote on Arab Americans in Houston.
Yes.
Christians. And so I went to this wonderful church. It's called the Arabic, I think it's the Arabic Christian Church in Houston. And it was unique because it was this Arab American church that conducted services in Arabic, but also conducted services in English, and had a very evangelical flair to it. And they did a lot of work with refugees. They did a lot of work with the local mosque. These are people that had been bitterly opposed to one another in their home countries, and had figured out ways to overcome that in Houston. So in many ways, it was really a feel good story and an inspiring place to be. Um, but part of what I encountered while I was in Houston, Houston is home to Joel Osteen, of course. So I think that when we're talking about how race interacts with American politics and American Christianity, um, that there's also always a discussion of how privilege is operating, how power is operating, and how money is operating. And so Joel Osteen, of course, one of the strongest purveyors of this idea of a prosperity gospel, which has been
I
a
guess you could
movement.
call that the unholy trinity, those three things you just mentioned.
Yes, yes. And that is a movement too that has been embraced globally, strongly in Africa, strongly, Joel Osteen's church is a church that is pretty diverse as far as race. So I think part of what is going on too sometimes is there's this role of money and access to money. And so back to Houston. I'm at this church. And it's been this lovely experience, and people that are just very down to earth, very rooted in the Bible and in the gospel. And then they invited in a guest preacher. Always a dangerous thing. And this guest preacher who came in, he was this man who had this interesting sort of conversion story, which sometimes when you're looking at prosperity gospel sort of mega church type leaders, if they have this really dramatic conversion story or miracle story, sometimes that's a little bit of a heads up that maybe they're not being entirely honest. So this guy had a story like that a little bit, in that he was a convert. His parents had been Muslim, and he did this whole demonstration as part of his sermon with different colored cloths. And I had never seen it before, but I think this is a pretty common thing that's sometimes used in evangelical churches, and maybe used in churches where a common language isn't shared, because it was a demonstration with colors. So he had a black cloth, a white cloth, and a red cloth. And again, when we're talking about the awareness of race, being in the room, thinking about those colors.
Yeah.
But when he did his presentation, those colors symbolized how sin and forgiveness and salvation worked together. And it was a demonstration that was very devoid of Jesus, very devoid of the cross, and very sort of focused in a transactional type of Christianity. And he was somebody who had been trained by Joel Osteen, had been baptized by Joel Osteen's father. And he was a person who was non-white, of Arab American roots. So I think that when he embraced that sense of theology, I think there's an attraction to the money and the power that overrides sort of the sense of race. But I know you and I were messaging earlier too about Ice Cube, and also this, recent Trump administration like reach out in Republican Party trying to attract Black men. And so I wondered what you've seen of that, and like what you think about the fact that it's sort of been agendered, like, well, Black women, fine, but we're going to go after the Black men. What is that about?
I mean, well, everything is still living in a sexist, patriarchal existence. But the thing with Ice Cube, well, first let me stick with this. I had to switch location. That example was with I remember that from the book, and I thought it was gross. It was basically the whiteness choking out the Blackness. As the whiteness is this holiness, the Blackness is this darkness, sin. And it just was so gross to me, and it was a reminder of the anti-Blackness that is worldwide. And that, so no matter what, where you look, what you look like, that's this idea that I don't want to be dark or associated with anything that is dark, because it's evil, bad, all of the things that we've placed on it. And I was listening to NPR. So this is how you're getting older, because you started a sentence with, I was listening to NPR. Well, I was listening to NPR earlier today, and they were talking about the Mexican Americans, oh, it was yesterday, Mexican Americans voting for Trump, and that percentage of Mexican Americans that vote for Trump. And it's part of it is, and it's something that I did already know, but they espouse to the anti-blackness. They're with that kind of hate language that he's using because they don't like black people. And one that was interesting because it's something I know as a black person, and this thing between blacks and Mexicans. But I also have not heard people actually speak about it and put it out there as to this percentage. While it's not a huge amount, but it's enough. It's enough to be frightening. Like, why would you vote against your own interest and vote for someone? But if your interest is to be anti-black, which a lot of people is, then you'll go for that. And so even with that sermon and that messaging and using those colors, which is an anti-blackness, and I don't think that person would see it in that way because they might not be completely aware of their own anti-blackness until it's brought up, until it's mentioned, So I think many cultures have to deal with that. Light is best, white is still always right, So while, I may appreciate being a dark-skinned black woman, and love what that means for me now, I also know was times where I had to struggle with that myself as a kid because you keep getting these, messages of what's beautiful, what's acceptable. And so that sermon was just a reiteration, again, using the gospel in a way to promote whiteness, keep white close to holiness, God, keep what's black, dirty, dark, and sinful, and something you want to get rid of. So when I read that, that was a gross moment for me. Mm-hmm. The other gross moment for me in the book was the first chapter when the preacher was talking about how holy Christopher Columbus.
Right.
You remember that?
Yes.
You want to speak to that a little bit? Like, I'll try to find that quote, but yeah, where he was this is the month of October, right? We're looking at changing it from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And what does the president go and do? Take an even harder, stronger stance by putting out a whole White House note and brief about Columbus Day and not letting people take that away. It just reminds me so much of that sermon when the preacher said basically how holy and great of a man Christopher Columbus was. I just was like, what were you thinking, feeling? And you said the room seemed to be numb. They didn't gasp. Yeah. But I did when I read that.
Yeah. Well, and even thinking about it now, I'm just sort of reflecting on that to blindly defend, something like Christopher Columbus Day. Why is it important? Why bother? This was all these years ago. Why? But then when I started thinking about that, I was also thinking about that there is an allowed sort of lazy type of thinking sometimes, and I can only point it out because I can remember it in myself. I live in Minneapolis. There's a lake here that's a chain of lakes here in Minneapolis. And one of the lakes growing up, I always knew it as Lake Calhoun. I did not know it was named Lake Calhoun because it was named after John C. Calhoun, who was a big segregationist, anti-black legislator in the U.S. Congress from, I believe, North Carolina. So why he's named a lake in Minnesota after him, I don't know. But there's been a movement, and it's now been changed to change the name of that lake to Bodie-Makaska, which is the original indigenous name of the lake. And I remember honestly in myself when that first started coming out, I was like, oh, well, why do we have to change it? That's what we think of it as. And, what kind of self-centered thinking? But I think that kind of unexamined thinking, so many of us who are white American Christians have been sort of allowed to just not to allow our own personal stories as to be the dominant narrative and not take into account the other stories. So, yeah, I mean, when hearing, there's certain things that you hear from conservative white male preachers that are kind of like red flags, and they go off in my head, whether it's sexism or racism. And that Columbus line was one of them because but it fit into a pattern. And the thing that he said that really has stuck with me and that really bothered me a lot is that he said he felt sorry for anyone who was born after, like, I think it was 1965. And he looked at it and he said, if you were born after 1965, I feel sorry for you because that's when our nation, went on a decline. Well, that was at the heart of
Right,
civil rights
exactly,
when
exactly.
Black people in America were finally getting some, at least, steps towards more equal rights. And so I thought that that was really quite a racist statement. And, to see this auditorium of people listening to that and not thinking about what that means when he says that for
Right,
Black people in America, that was a moment for me.
right, right. Well, one of the questions that um, was given to me to ask you is have your opinion shifted at all since you wrote the book? And from this conversation, I know it has, and you've shared in some ways, especially as it relates to racism. But
Yeah.
in what other ways have you noticed that you've had a shift of opinion? And then the next question would be, what do you feel are good questions for conversations with red state Christians?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's been the biggest shift is just, and for me it's been a spiritual experience in a lot of ways that I feel God challenging me, and part of this understanding of how I, as a white pastor and writer, am being called to speak more explicitly about race in my writing, about Christianity. That continues to be something that I think God is challenging me to do. It happened again this morning. So what I was going to say about this morning, I was on at 3:30 a.m. A broadcast with Sky News, originated in London, and the interviewer asked me a question that I was not prepared for. She
Mm,
asked me a question about what American voters are thinking about the faith of the running mates of Mike Pence and of Kamala Harris. And I was very prepared to talk about Mike Pence's faith. And I was not that prepared to talk about Kamala Harris's faith. And that was another situation where I had to look at myself and think, how have I, even in ways where I want to call out some of the problems with white conservative Christianity, how have I also presented white conservative Christianity as the default mode of Christianity in this country
yeah,
when Kamala Harris has written about her Christian faith and has, experienced some of the same things that Barack Obama experienced as president, where his Christian faith was constantly questioned, was constantly challenged. You'll still have millions of people in America who will insist that he is a Muslim for no other reason than that he has dark skin. So I was, that's another area where I was challenged again this morning, just in thinking about why do I not know more about Kamala Harris' faith and why am I not more prepared to talk about it? Um, Other ways in that my opinions have shifted a little bit. Those have been the two main things. I think that I've also, in writing the book, I had some hopefulness for the anti-abortion movement in America, and I could see ways where people within that movement were challenging themselves to expand what they meant by pro-life and to think about refugees, to think about capital punishment, to think about our justice system as all being pro-life issues. And so I think I was fairly sympathetic. I think that, just as we've seen, not only with COVID, but also with, today, Amy Coney Barrett was voted into the Supreme Court,
right.
and voted in very much because of her bona fides as an anti-abortion judge. And just to see how cavalier that even she was, to, her first event as a nominee, as a judge, results in COVID diagnoses for all
Right.
kinds of people, many of whom we probably don't even know. People who were catering the event, people who were cleaning the event, people who were drivers. Um, and the ways that she sort of didn't seem too bothered by that and now participates in another event. And yet she's called pro-life. So I think that I've become more critical of people who are who just unqualified will say, well, I'm pro-life and I have to vote for Trump because, and I think that I have less sympathy for that response now, and I would challenge that response even more harshly because of what we've learned about the total disregard for life by
Right.
American politicians in light of COVID.
Right. So, well, how would you say we go into a conversation with red state Christians? Is there a best practices type of a way to have conversations if you are more liberal leaning? Would you say attempt or just forget it?
Well, and one thing that I tried to keep in mind with my reporting in this book is that I was able to have some more conversations in that book because of my identity. Because am white, I was able to safely have some conversations with people that maybe a person of color would not have been as safe having. Maybe a person who is LGBTQ would not have been as safe having those conversations. So I think that when I challenge people to have dialogue and to be open to be surprised by one another, I do think it's also important to keep yourself safe and to not allow someone in interest of a conversation to take away your own personhood. So I always keep in mind the scripture passage where Jesus sends out the 40 to go and to spread the gospel, but he says, if you're not received, then you wipe the dust off your feet and you leave. So I think that that's a truth and that's real. But I also will say, as much as I sometimes want to be cynical or frustrated, God always brings me back to hope. And one of my biggest sources of hope is my church. I serve a church in rural Minnesota, about an hour west of Minneapolis, in a county that I think voted for Trump by 38 points in 2016. And I am just really encouraged by the willingness of people in that little community to be there for each other, to listen to one another, to be open to the writing and the work that I'm doing as their pastor, and to continue to put our shared humanity first. And, I had a conversation with someone in my church after, I attended protests for George Floyd, and there were people in my church who wanted to talk about that, but they talked about it with me, which was really important to me. And we had the opportunity to talk about, how saying Black Lives Matter is not me saying that your relative who's a police officer doesn't matter, but I still need to say it. So I think I always look for points of connection in conversation, finding a point of connection with someone who you disagree with, whether it's over something that you share as your family, whether it's what you share as a parent, finding those points of connection and moving from there. And, just being willing to be vulnerable and to find ways to have these conversations. I think I always challenge white American Christians to start in our families. Try not to maybe do it over social media, but start in your family. It's harder in COVID to have the face-to-face, but figure out, maybe it's a phone call.
That's what I say too. I always say, go get your cousins.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Right. If
And
you can do that, hey, we can get somewhere.
exactly. And local churches too. I mean, go get our parishioners. How do we talk together as local, white churches? So that's where I think a lot of the work begins. I still, have family members who really, really disagree with me on a lot of this stuff. And sometimes we can have helpful conversations together, and sometimes we can't. But we have found ways to preserve those relationships while still living in the truth. And I'm hopeful that sometimes it's the work of the Holy Spirit to continue to open doors and to change hearts and to allow the truth to be spoken.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, sometimes you have to be okay with knowing that you're not going to come to an agreement.
Right. Right.
Sometimes I sit and I watch Fox News, not because I'm watching it because I'm going to agree with them. I'm listening because I'm truly trying to learn and understand the perspective of the other.
Yeah.
If it can be understood. Um, I'm really trying to increase my own compassion, my own empathy in some ways, knowing that I have people who I do love and care about as well, who are Republican, who will likely vote for this president again, even with all of the things that has happened and went down. And so if I don't want to um, sever all ties to them, then I have to kind of come to this space, like you said, like knowing, all right, figure out how to preserve our relationship, knowing that there are going to be some major things that we don't agree about. Now that there is a line, there can be a line for me. Of course, you have to see me as a human being. I'm a person. I count. I matter. And so
Right.
the racism is not negotiable, you know, for me. And I think even people who are leaning heavy, and this is what was my question to you, is really thinking about moving forward and the level of the president's behavior just being, I feel, from that first debate till now completely, he's just unhinged. He's in straight up, I feel, desperation mode, want to win, and just totally speaking to his base. How do you just going back through all those interviews and all those communities and all those people you sat with, pew after pew after pew, having these conversations and listening? How do you think he's measuring now with those groups of people? And then thinking about, I know you spent time in Pennsylvania, and that's a hot spot for him. How do you think he's tracking? Do you think that those folks still have the same convictions for him? Are they really that seriously this one single issue? Or are people looking at his character and the ways that he's behaving, and is that enough for them just to say, I need to do something else?
Yeah, what I've been pretty certain of, even, before 2020 and everything, 2020 has shaken everything up, but this is still held true for me. I think that the intensity of affection that Trump's base feels for him, that sort of consistent, say, 36-ish% or so, which is still a lot of people. I think that that has intensified, that people have become more devoted to Trump personally. They've become more willing to accept really inflammatory rhetoric. But I think that around the edges, and you see in the book that I talked to a lot of people who were sort of around the edges,
Yeah.
who were more motivated by dislike of Hillary Clinton than like of Donald Trump. Which, talking about sexism, Joe Biden just does not, he doesn't inspire that same antipathy in Christian voters that she did. And of course, none of this conversation exists without the role of right-wing media and the role of, honestly, sometimes, propaganda that's originating in Russia and originating in other countries that's meant to inflame Americans. Recently this week in Minneapolis, there was a story that came out that unfortunately didn't get a lot of attention, but a member of the Boogaloo Boys was arrested as being the inciter of many of the fires and rioting that happened in Minneapolis in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
And that's a right
And
wing
yeah.
white male group. Um, and the narrative became, oh well, these protesters, they're rioting, they're ruining this, and so it's very insidious that a right wing white male Christian group, or not Christian necessarily, but group was inciting a lot of this violence and destruction. Um, so all
And
that,
it also speaks to how ready we are, how ready
yeah,
this country is to
yes,
accept that it is the protesters really, they're saying black and brown people,
right,
they're ready to accept that we're the ones causing the damage and doing the, and
right,
that's why, and these people, the Boogaloo Boys or whatever they call, that's why I knew they could do that,
yeah,
because it's already this idea that we're the violent people, we're the people that can't be trusted, we're the ones that want to trash the neighborhoods. Like Trump said in one of his speeches to the suburban women, "Come on, I'm saving your neighborhoods." Like, okay, yeah,
so the the hopeful part of me thinks that we're going to see a big shift in, white women voted for Trump in 2016. I don't necessarily think you're going to see that again. I think that you're going to see more women who may be voting differently than their husbands this election. And I'm hearing that, anecdotally, and I'm seeing that in some polling as well. And I think that messaging has a lot to do with this total disregard for human life that this administration and the Republican Party at large has shown during COVID, and also during police brutality and the protests
yeah,
around race. I also think that you're going to see a shift in Catholic voters, and Catholic voters are going to be very instrumental, not only in Pennsylvania, but in Wisconsin. I mean,
hmm,
Wisconsin, right where you are, I've always thought that's really going to be the state to watch. Um, Catholic voters voted for Trump in pretty big margins, and that was a swing category from the two elections with President Obama. And so I think Catholics in America are very divided. But Catholic voters, I think you're going to see, are feeling more free in 2020. Joe Biden is a white Catholic, for one thing, and he's a man. So you're going to see them feeling more free to vote for him. And I think in 2016, I have an article coming out tonight for Fortune magazine about this. That in 2016, it was popular and acceptable to be really cynical and to listen to Trump say things like, well, how much worse can it get? And to have
right. And he
this,
got here and the bottom done about falling out.
right, right,
So he's like,
exactly.
"Oh, let me show
Um,
you how much worse it can get."
yeah. And there was a lot of cynicism on the part of, white working class voters. And I think that it's really tough to just continue to be totally cynical in a time when a lot of Americans have been personally touched by COVID. It's just difficult
Yeah,
to remain cynical and to not want to reach for something more deep and more powerful in a time when Americans have experienced massive grief and
yeah.
mourning. So I think that some of those shifts that we'll see, but I did not think Donald Trump was going to win in 2016, and I lived in a very red precinct,
Mm,
and I was caught very off guard. So, like
mm.
many people, I think this year, there's a lot of, you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty about
Well,
what will
my sister is certain that Donald Trump is going to cheat and be president again. I'm certain he will try to cheat. I'm just hoping that he will not be the one that is found to be president again. But you
happen. Well,
never
yeah,
know. We just watch. This is, how scriptures say, watch and pray.
yeah.
Man, this is straight up watching and praying, um, and fasting season, and
Are
it
you?
is definitely. I think it's also been a time for us as Christians to look at ourselves, look at who we are and how
Yeah.
how we're allowing ourselves to represent who we say Jesus Christ is, and
Yeah.
what's that looking like across this country, across the world, how we are, what messages we're letting be loud, you
Yeah.
know. So to talk about being greedy and um, you know, just taking on this idea that luxury and those that type of um, way of living is what it is that God is most where God is most found, or
Right.
what makes God pleased. I mean, you know, we just got to start questioning that even more,
Right.
um, more so, I think. But what I want to ask you as we wrap up is more personal. How are you as a mom dealing with this with your children? How are you being able to have conversations with them about racism? Because I think that's very much so important today, um, and how we're equipping our children to hopefully lead us into a better country, a better way of being human together. Really.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we talk. So I'm the mother of two white boys, and I don't think we talk enough about the importance of how white parents are parenting white boys in particular. You know, there's a lot of talk about how parents of children of color have been impacted by racism, or how to parent children of color. But how we're parenting our white boys in America, I think is going to be really critical to confronting racism in the next generation. So that's important to me. I'm sure that I'm, screwing it up all the time. But one of the things that was powerful for me is that when I went to a larger protest here in Minneapolis, there was a smaller protest right in our neighborhood of Minneapolis, just a couple blocks away. And my husband brought my two boys to the protest, and my youngest son was 4 at the time, and he wanted to wear this equality shirt that he got from my brother, his uncle, and that became like his favorite shirt that he wore all the time. And sometimes when we were interacting with people in our family who are um, you know more on the Trump side of things, he always seems to pick out to wear that shirt, which is funny. But to see my boys carrying signs that say justice for George Floyd, and to talk to them about what happened here in Minneapolis and why it was important for us to be present at the protest, rather than, some people in our neighborhood were picking up and honestly, I mean, some people were picking up and leaving for the suburbs for the night. And that sent a message to me that their property was more important than what happened to George Floyd.
Oh, I
So
have a whole little rhetoric about that.
yeah,
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 property over people.
right,
I mean,
right,
that's been this country since the very beginning,
right,
when they decided to take the land from natives and
yeah,
decided that it was more important for them to own and have the land than those people live, survive, and flourish.
yeah.
Yeah,
And to treat Black people as property in the U.S.
exactly.
Constitution, I think too. Um,
Exactly.
so we talk about things, and my oldest son Jacob is 8 now, and he's just kind of an old soul and a thinker, and he wants to ask a lot of questions. And he and his buddy were talking about Donald Trump at the park today, and my son was going back and forth with him about it. And my youngest son, when we found out that my brother and sister-in-law were pregnant, my youngest son, I remember after we found out, he kind of looked at me and he said, "Mom, is Kevin and Bianca's baby gonna be brown?" And I said, "Yeah, their baby is gonna be brown." And he was just like, "Oh, okay." But that consciousness of kids that's so moldable at that age, that that we can have those open conversations, and not that I wouldn't respond to that as, "Oh no, we're not going to talk about that." But yeah, their baby is going to be a different color than you, and it's still going to be your cousin. And, I don't know. I just think it's the beginning of a lot of conversations. And
Yeah.
I'm a parent who doesn't want to block off my kids from learning about things. I want to talk to them as adults, and I never really err on the side of overly shielding them from anything because I want them to have the language to talk about this stuff. Thanks for asking. It's a really important thing, obviously, and something I'm still working on.
Oh yeah, I know you're a mom, I'm a mom, and I think really we really have to talk about racism across the generations. That's been something I've really been stressing lately, and when I'm doing talks and doing presentations, that's what I'm talking about. Generational racism. And
Mm.
that is the thing that we continue to spread and give from one generation to the next. And so we have to really be honest and talk about it, and really equip our children to be a better generation, than ours, as it relates to human relationships around, racism. So, yeah. Well, I do appreciate your time and you hanging out,
Yeah.
um, and chatting. I think it was cool. We look to see what will happen in the week to come,
Yeah.
with this election. Do you want to share anything for us to look out for, as you are ramping up
Well,
your
um,
writings?
I was gonna say I'm gonna be praying for you guys in Milwaukee that everybody who wants to vote is gonna be given the opportunity to vote. And I know there was a decision today about mail-in ballots in Wisconsin that now they're not gonna accept them after a certain time. So I know that I don't know. So I was thinking about that. I am working on a second book project, and the working title is called Make America Dream Again, Birthing Hope in the Heartland. And I'm working with a rural public health expert. Her name's Katie Bacchus Casamano. She's also my cousin, my second cousin, technically. Um, so we're excited about that. We have a phone conversation with our agent coming up on Friday. So things are kind of moving. I'm super nervous. But I want to continue to tell the stories of people whose stories are not being told in America. So that's why we're wanting to focus on telling stories of rural women. And I'm excited about that. At some point, I got to move on from talking about red state Christians, and I probably won't be too sad to do that.
Okay. No, good. Well, folks can find you how?
Yeah, so I I do a lot on Twitter, Angela_Denker, and just a lot of news articles, and you can always find my recent writing there. You can also go to angeladenker.com to sign up for my newsletter. I send that out once a month. Upcoming events, doing a lot of Zoom stuff, and my church is Grace Lutheran in Broughton, and you can always watch our services on Facebook Live if you ever want to join us.
Yay! All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate you giving me some time this evening. Thanks, to those who were watching now, who will watch later. We don't have our next books picked for the book club yet, but you can watch out for that. I think I'll start a new book in the new year. I'm giving myself a little bit of a break, and I need to see what happens after this election. And we'll definitely dive into something I think that will hopefully be healing for us
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
So, Angela, you have a very good night, and I appreciate you.
Bye. Thanks
Blessings to
for having
you.
me. Thank you. Shout
Yeah.
out to Bishop E.L. Curry who brought us together. I hope he
Woo
gets a chance
woo.
to watch
Yeah.
this.
I need to harass him. He on my list. I'm gonna harass you about something else later. It's a little bit different than this, but
Okay.
all right. Good
Have a good night.
night.
Bye, everyone.
The broadcast of Facebook Live has stopped.